Elias Carter could barely see the outline of his cabin through the storm, the lantern in his hand flickering madly in the wind. The mountain was alive with fury. Wind screamed through the pine ridges, tearing branches like paper. Snow and sleet whipped across the valley, turning the night into a blinding white void. Then he heard it again, a sound that didn't belong to any storm. A desperate, piercing cry, somewhere between pain and fear. It echoed through the darkness, rising and breaking like a human voice. Elias froze, heart pounding. It came again, a wild, haunting whinny carried by the wind. Something out there was fighting for its life. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The snow thickened, falling in frantic spirals around him. Elias lowered his lantern to shield it from the gusts, his breath turning to steam. "What in God's name?" he muttered under his beard, eyes narrowing toward the sound. Beyond the fence, shadows moved, large, unsteady shapes swaying against the storm. He trudged forward, boots sinking deep into the drifts until the light caught a flash of chestnut brown. It was a horse, a wild one, its coat slick with ice, muscles trembling. And beside her, half buried in snow, lay a foal, kicking weakly, trying to rise but collapsing again. For a heartbeat, Elias stood frozen, torn between reason and instinct. Wild Mustangs were dangerous. They didn't beg for help. They fought it. But as lightning split the sky, he saw her eyes, golden, terrified, pleading. Something long buried inside him cracked open. He threw down the lantern, dropped to his knees, and began clearing snow away from the foal. Its leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. "Easy now, little one," he said softly, voice rough from years of disuse. The mare stamped her hoof, snorting clouds of steam, but didn't attack. She hovered protectively, trembling, eyes darting between Elias and her baby. "All right, girl," he whispered, meeting her gaze. "We're doing this together." With a grunt, Elias slid his arms beneath the foal's small, icy body. It was lighter than he expected, all bones and fear. As he stood, the mare cried out, a sound so raw it shook him to the core. For a second he thought she'd charge. Instead, she followed, step for step, through the storm toward the flickering light of his barn. Inside, the warmth was faint, just the dying glow of old coals and the smell of hay. Elias kicked the door shut against the wind, laid the foal on the straw, and grabbed a blanket from a hook. His hands moved fast, sure. The old instincts came flooding back. The healer, the horseman, the man he used to be. The foal whimpered when he touched its leg. Broken for sure. "You picked a bad night to be born," Elias murmured, reaching for the lantern. He found a few boards, tore them down to size, and began to splint the leg with careful precision. "Stay with me, little one." The mare hovered just behind him, close enough that he could feel her breath on his neck. Each time he spoke, her ears flicked forward. When he wrapped the final bandage, she lowered her head and touched his shoulder, a gesture so gentle it stopped him cold. He turned slowly. "You trust me now, huh?" he whispered. The mare blinked, then shifted her weight, standing over her foal as though acknowledging a silent truce. Elias sat back on his heels. For the first time in 2 years, the silence inside him, the hollow place that had been there since Mary's death, wasn't empty. It was full of breathing, warmth, and life. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, beating against the barn like an angry drum. Elias stoked a small fire in the corner, feeding it broken boards and bits of hay. The orange glow danced over the mare's coat, turning her into a creature of living bronze. He leaned against the post, exhaustion pulling at his eyes, but he didn't dare leave. He watched the foal's chest rise and fall, the mare's shadow swaying softly beside it. She came here for help, he whispered to himself. She could have gone anywhere, but she came to me. The thought unsettled him. Since Mare died, he'd avoided every sign of life, the townsfolk, the mountains, even the sunrise. He'd told himself he was content being alone, that solitude was his penance. Yet now, in the middle of a storm, a wild creature had sought him out, as if the world itself refused to let him vanish. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls. Somewhere above, a loose board rattled. Elias tightened his coat and stared at the fire, his mind drifting to a memory he hadn't allowed in years. Mary's laughter echoing off the canyon walls, her hands soft against a horse's muzzle. "Every living thing deserves a chance," she'd said once. "Even the wild ones." He swallowed hard, forcing the memory away. The foal stirred, letting out a soft cry. Elias rose, knelt beside it, and adjusted the splint. "You're going to be all right," he murmured. "Your mama's right here." The mare nickered quietly, nuzzling her baby's neck. Elias smiled faintly. "You're a good mother," he said, his voice breaking on the word mother. Outside, the storm began to fade, the thunder rolling farther into the mountains. The wind softened to a whisper. Elias could hear the faint drip of melting snow from the eaves. He stood, stretching his back, and walked to the barn door. Pushing it open, he stepped into the cold dawn air. The sky was turning from black to gray, clouds still hanging low over the peaks. The scent of wet earth and pine filled his lungs. Sharp, clean, alive. Behind him, the mare gave a low call. He turned to see her standing in the barn's doorway, her mane tangled, her eyes fixed on him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, man and beast, both scarred, both still standing. Elias raised a hand slowly, palm open. "You're something else, girl," he said softly. "Maybe you came here for a reason." The mare didn't move, but her gaze softened, and for the first time in years, Elias felt warmth spreading through the cold edges of his heart. He lowered his hand, took one last look at the valley below, white, silent, endless, and whispered to himself, "Maybe this storm wasn't meant to break me. Maybe it was meant to bring me back." The morning sun crept slowly over Bitterroot Valley, spilling light across the mountains and melting the last crusts of snow from the trees. The storm had passed, but its memory still clung to the land. The bent pine branches, the broken fence posts, the heavy silence that follows nature's rage. Inside the barn, that same silence wrapped around Elias Carter like a fragile peace. He stirred from where he'd dozed beside the foal, his body stiff from the cold floor. The little one lay curled in the straw, breathing softly, its leg bound tight with the makeshift splint. The mare stood watch close by, her chestnut coat gleaming faintly in the pale light that slipped through the cracks in the boards. When Elias rose, she didn't flinch. She just blinked slowly, as if she'd been waiting for him to wake. "Well," he said quietly, rubbing his aching neck, "you two made it through the night." His voice sounded rough, even to himself. He wasn't used to talking much anymore, not since the days when the cabin had been full of laughter and the smell of bread baking. He reached for the bucket, filled it from the barrel by the door, and set it near the mare. "Drink. You've earned it." The mare lowered her head, nostrils flaring, and began to drink. The sound, simple, rhythmic, filled the barn in a way that made the place feel alive again. Elias crouched beside the foal, checking the splint. The swelling had gone down a little, the color looked better. "You're a fighter," he murmured. "Guess your mama raised you right." The barn door creaked open, and a gust of cold air swept in, along with the scent of pine and coffee. A woman's voice called out, firm but familiar. "Elias Carter, you alive in there?" He turned toward the door, blinking in the bright light. "Clara Monroe," he said with a hint of surprise. "What brings you up the mountain this early?" Clara stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her gray hair tucked under a wool hat. In one hand, she carried a canvas sack. "The bridge washed out last night," she said. "Figured you might be low on supplies. Brought some flour, coffee, and—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the mare. "Good Lord, Elias, what on earth is that doing in your barn?" Elias followed her gaze. She showed up in the storm, brought her foal with her. Legs broken, Clara moved closer, her eyes softening. "You patched him up yourself." "Did what I could," Elias said. "It's not pretty, but it's holding." Clara knelt beside the foal, inspecting the splint with the practiced eye of someone who'd once treated animals for a living. "You've still got the hands of a horseman," she said quietly. Then her tone changed, tinged with concern. "But you know this could get you in trouble, right? Keeping wild Mustangs is a federal offense. Rangers have been cracking down since that group of trappers started catching them last fall." Elias leaned against the stall door, arms folded. "I'm not keeping her," he said. "Just giving her a place to heal." Clara sighed, straightening. "You always did have a way with lost causes." He gave a faint smile. "Guess I'm one myself." For a moment, neither spoke. The mare watched them both, ears twitching but calm. The foal gave a small, contented sigh, and Clara's expression softened. "They trust you," she said. "That doesn't happen by accident?" Elias shrugged. Maybe they didn't have any other choice. Clara looked at him, and he saw the question in her eyes. The one she didn't ask anymore. Whether he'd ever give life another chance. She'd been the only person to visit since Mary's death, bringing coffee, letters, and sometimes silence. After a while, Clara moved to the stall gate. "You know, the Rangers aren't your biggest problem," she said. "Word travels fast in Silver Creek. Tommy Dawson's back in town." Elias stiffened. "Red Dawson?" "The very same. He's been bragging at the tavern that there's a rare Mustang roaming near Bitterroot. Claims it's his, says he's got papers to prove it. You know that man. He'll twist the law any way it suits him." Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Red Dawson. A name from another life. A life filled with dust, auction rings, and too many regrets. He'd beaten Red once at a sale years ago. Won a stallion that the man had tried to break with cruelty. Red never forgot humiliation. "I'll handle it," Elias said quietly. Clara frowned. "Handle it how?" "You can't fight him alone." "I don't plan to fight," he said. "Just to keep what's mine safe." She studied him a long moment, then nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "That man's as mean as winter and twice as patient." When she left, the barn felt colder. Elias watched her ride down the trail until the snow swallowed her figure, then turned back to the horses. Spirit, the name had come to him without thinking, was standing near the door, the sunlight glinting off her mane. He reached out slowly, palm open. She didn't back away this time. Her muzzle brushed his hand, warm and damp. "You're something else," he whispered. "Spirit suits you." The words seemed to settle in the air, fitting her perfectly. Days passed. The snow melted, and the forest began to hum again with crows and melting water. Elias spent his mornings tending to the foal, Hope, he'd started calling her, and repairing the fence line. Every night, Spirit would wander outside the barn, circle the pasture, then return to rest beside her baby. She could have run, but she never did. Each morning brought a fragile peace, but it couldn't last. Rumors from Silver Creek trickled up the mountain like cold water. Riders seen near the ridge, a campfire glowing where no one lived. Clara came again one afternoon, her face tight with worry. "Elias," she said, dismounting fast, "Red's been asking questions about you. Says he's got men scouting the valley. I think he's looking for your mare." Elias didn't look up from the trough he was filling. "Let him look. He won't find her." "Don't be stubborn," Clara snapped. "He's dangerous. He's got friends in the sheriff's office, too. If he claims that mare's his, they'll come up here with papers and take her." "Then what?" Elias finally turned. The years had carved deep lines in his face, but his eyes were clear. "Then I'll do what's right," he said. She shook her head. "You can't save everything, Elias." He smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile. "Maybe not. But I can try." That night, the wind returned, sweeping through the valley with the promise of another storm. Elias sat by the barn door, watching Spirit and Hope sleep in the straw. The firelight painted them in gold and shadow, the kind of beauty that made a man forget the darkness waiting beyond the walls. He thought of Clara's warning, of Red's grin, of the law that didn't care about right or wrong, only ownership. And he thought of Mary's words echoing from long ago. Every living thing deserves a chance, even the wild ones. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, a low growl beneath the mountains. Elias glanced toward the ridge where the sky pulsed with far-off lightning. He knew it wasn't just another storm coming. He reached for his lantern, trimmed the wick, and set it by the door. "You hear that, girl?" he said softly to Spirit. "Sounds like trouble's on its way." The mare lifted her head, ears pricked, eyes glowing in the dim light, like she understood. Elias stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, waiting for the storm and whatever men might come with it. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote cried, and the valley answered back with silence. The kind that comes before everything changes. The days that followed were quieter, the kind of quiet that hides unease beneath the surface. The storm had cleared, leaving Bitterroot Valley bright and sharp under a hard blue sky. Meltwater streamed through the gullies, and the air smelled of pine and thawing earth. But Elias Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, like the calm that comes before the next round of thunder. Each morning, he woke before dawn, brewed coffee over the stove, and walked out to the barn. Spirit would be waiting by the fence, her head lifting the moment she saw him. Hope hobbled on her mended leg, stronger each day, her small body bursting with defiance. Elias would check the splint, change the wrappings, then brush Spirit's coat until it shone in the slanted sunlight. He never said it aloud, but the rhythm of their mornings had become a kind of prayer. Sometimes Clara joined him, her laughter echoing in the cold air. She'd bring biscuits wrapped in cloth, tease him about the dust in his cabin, or talk about the valley thawing into spring. They didn't speak of Red Dawson again, not directly. But every now and then, Elias caught her looking at the ridge, her brow furrowed, as if expecting trouble to ride over it any moment. One afternoon, as the sun sank behind the western peaks, Elias leaned on the fence and watched Spirit and Hope play in the snowmelt puddles. The foal kicked up her heels clumsily, splashing water into the air. Spirit whinnied softly, the sound carrying like music across the empty valley. Elias smiled, the corners of his mouth cracking beneath his beard. "You'll run free soon enough, little one," he murmured. It had been years since he'd spoken with such warmth. Clara noticed. "You're changing," she said, stepping up beside him. "When I first met you after Mary's death, you looked like a man carved out of stone. Now you look like someone learning how to breathe again." Elias's smile faded a little. "Maybe I just forgot how good it feels to care about something." She studied him quietly. "Or someone," she said. He didn't answer, and she didn't press. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, like two people who had learned to respect the ghosts the other carried. But peace in the mountains never lasted long. That night, as the wind picked up, a strange unease crept through Elias's chest. He stoked the fire in the cabin, but his thoughts kept wandering back to the ridge. Somewhere out there, he imagined the crackle of a distant campfire, the glint of eyes watching from the dark. He wasn't wrong. Down in the hollow beyond the ridge, 3 men sat huddled around a small fire. Their horses stood tethered among the trees, steam rising from their backs. The leader, Tommy Red Dawson, wore a scar across his cheek that caught the firelight every time he turned his head. He pulled from a flask and spat into the dirt. "She's up there, I know it," he said, voice low and cold. "Carter's always had a thing for stray horses. Couldn't resist a wild one if his life depended on it." One of the younger men frowned. "You sure it's the same mare, Red?" Could be any Mustang. Red's grin was thin and sharp. "Ain't just any Mustang. Chestnut mare, white blaze, fast as hell. I been tracking her for weeks before that blizzard hit. Lost her tracks near Carter's place. Now I hear from town folks that he's nursing a wild one back to health. That's no coincidence." The third man, older, rubbed his hands near the fire. "You planning to talk to him? Or just take her?" Red's eyes gleamed. "Depends how polite Carter's feeling." He leaned back against a log, staring into the flames. "That man thinks he's some kind of saint, saving what don't belong to him. But every saint's got his breaking point." The men fell silent, the only sound the crackle of fire and the restless stamping of horses. In the distance, the wind howled through the pines like a warning neither of them cared to heed. The next morning, Elias woke before dawn to an uneasy stillness. The birds hadn't started singing yet, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He dressed quickly, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stepped outside. Frost glittered across the fields, and his breath rose in thin plumes. He walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. Spirit greeted him with a soft nicker. Hope nuzzled his hand eagerly, her strength returning faster than he'd expected. He smiled, feeling the rare, quiet pride of watching something fragile fight its way back to life. Then he noticed something, a faint set of boot prints near the fence line. Too large, too deep to be Clara's. He crouched, tracing them with his fingers. The edges were sharp, fresh from the night before. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but he could feel it. The sense of being watched. When Clara arrived later that day, he didn't tell her about the tracks. She brought bandages, some oats, and a loaf of fresh bread. "The road's clear now," she said. "Snow's melting fast. Red's been seen around the valley again. You should keep that rifle close." Elias nodded but said nothing. He didn't want to feed her worry. Instead, he changed the subject, asking about the town, the spring festival, anything else. She humored him, but the unease between them lingered like a shadow neither could name. That evening, after Clara left, Elias saddled his old gelding, Rusty, and rode up the ridge. The snow was thin here, crunching softly under the horse's hooves. From the top, he could see the whole valley spread out below him, his cabin a dark dot in a sea of silver and green. The air smelled of sap and thawed mud. Then he saw it, a wisp of smoke curling up from the hollow beyond the ridge. He reined Rusty in hard, heart pounding. It wasn't a ranger's fire, too low, too hidden. He knew exactly who it belonged to. Red Dawson had come closer. Elias sat there a long moment, watching the smoke drift against the pale sky. He knew he couldn't hide spirit and hope forever. The mare had begun to wander farther from the barn each day, drawn by instinct to the freedom of the open range. If Red saw her, it would only take one bullet to end it all. When he rode back down, the valley was bathed in the soft gold of twilight. He unsaddled Rusty, rubbed him down, and walked straight to the barn. Spirit stood inside, ears twitching, eyes bright. She looked wild again tonight, restless, uneasy. Elias laid a hand on her neck. "You feel it too, don't you, girl?" he whispered. "Something's coming." Outside, thunder rumbled far away, soft and distant. He turned toward the foal, who was now standing on her own for longer stretches, wobbling but proud. "You're gonna run one day," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "Run like the wind and never look back." He stepped outside, breathing in the sharp mountain air. The stars were starting to appear, scattered and bright. For a brief, fragile moment, he felt peace. Like maybe this was what redemption looked like. Not a grand miracle, just a man, two wild hearts, and a quiet valley trying to heal. Then a horse whinnied somewhere up the trail, a sound not from his barn. Elias froze. Another answered, faint but clear. He knew that call. Red Dawson's men were scouting the ridge. He tightened his jaw, turning back toward the cabin. "All right," he muttered. "If it's a fight they want, I'll be ready." The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. Spirit lifted her head toward the hills, her body tense. The night deepened around them, and far off in the dark, thunder rolled like the growl of something old and dangerous awakening. The storm hadn't come yet, but everyone in Bitterroot Valley could feel it coming. The next morning broke gray and still. The mountains wore a low crown of mist, and the air felt heavy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Elias Carter woke before sunrise, the unease from the night still gnawing at his chest. The faint echo of distant hooves lingered in his mind, like a dream he couldn't shake. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the dying fire. Outside, the valley seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the crows, those loud morning heralds, were absent. Elias stood, poured cold coffee from the pot, and drank it down in one bitter swallow. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the chill. Frost clung to the grass, and the first light of dawn painted the peaks in pale gold. For a moment, it looked peaceful again. Too peaceful. He walked to the barn. Spirit was standing near the door, ears pricked, body tense. Hope stood beside her, leaning lightly on her mended leg, stronger now, but not yet whole. Elias stroked the mare's neck, feeling the tremor beneath her skin. "You heard them too, didn't you?" he murmured. The mare exhaled sharply, stamping her hoof once. Elias nodded. "We'll be ready." He spent the morning checking the fences, hammering loose boards, and cleaning his old Winchester rifle. The gun hadn't seen use in years, but it still gleamed under the light. He loaded it slowly, each shell sliding into place with a metallic click that echoed in the silence. By mid-morning, he heard the distant creak of a wagon on the trail. His stomach tightened. He reached for the rifle, but then he heard a woman's voice call his name. "Elias? You out here?" He lowered the weapon and exhaled. Clara Monroe appeared on horseback, her brown coat dusted with frost, her eyes sharp with worry. "You shouldn't be up here," Elias said. She swung down from her horse. "Neither should they." Elias frowned. "Who?" "Red Dawson and his men," she said, her voice low. "They were in town last night, bragging about heading into the mountains. The sheriff told them to stay out of your land, but you know how that goes." Elias looked toward the ridge. The fog hung thick up there, hiding whatever waited beyond. Clara followed his gaze. "You can't face them alone," she said. "You should let me ride to town, get help." He shook his head. "By the time you get back, it'll be over." "Elias." He turned to her, his voice firm but calm. "I've run from things before, Clara." "Not this time." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're as stubborn as the mountains." "Maybe that's why I'm still here," he said, almost smiling. She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then promise me one thing. Don't let that stubbornness get you killed." He squeezed her hand in return. "I'll do my best." When she left, the valley fell quiet again. Elias returned to the barn, where Spirit paced restlessly, sensing the storm in the air. He unlatched the gate, letting her roam the pasture. "If things go bad," he said softly, "you run. Take the little one and go." Spirit stared at him for a long moment, then lowered her head, as if she understood. The hours crawled by. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and wet pine. Elias stood by the porch, rifle resting across his arm, watching the ridge. Just after noon, he saw them. 3 riders emerged from the fog, their horses dark against the pale backdrop. They moved slow, deliberate, like men who knew they were being watched. At their head rode Red Dawson, broad-shouldered, scar still slashing across his cheek, his smile as mean as Elias remembered. "Morning, Carter," Red called as they reached the gate. His voice was loud and easy, but his hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "Heard you've been keeping something that don't belong to you." Elias stayed still. "She's not yours." Red laughed. "Oh, come on now. You think that mare just wandered up here by chance? She's mine. Got the brand to prove it." "She's wild," Elias said evenly. "You don't own the wild." Red's grin widened. "That's where you're wrong, old man. Out here, anything you can catch is yours. Always has been." Elias lifted the rifle slightly, not aiming, just reminding the men he held it. "Turn around, Dawson. Go back to town. There's no trouble for you here unless you bring it." Red spat into the dirt. "You think you can scare me with that antique? I've seen you shoot." "You're slow now." Carter Elias's voice dropped low. "Try me." For a heartbeat, the world held still. Even the wind stopped. Then Red smiled thinly and nudged his horse forward. "You always were the righteous type," he said. "Well, righteousness don't feed a man. Horses do." He turned to his men. "Rope her." The younger of the two shifted uneasily. "Boss, maybe we should," Red snapped. "Do it!" Elias raised the rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder. The horses reared, snorting in panic. "I said leave," Elias barked. Red glared at him, eyes burning. "You're making a mistake." "I made plenty already," Elias said. "Not this one." For a moment, Red looked like he might draw his gun. Then he smiled again. Slow. Dangerous. "You can't guard her forever, Carter. You gotta sleep sometime." He turned his horse and rode off, the other two following. Their silhouettes disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the trees. Elias stood there long after they were gone, the echo of the shot ringing in his ears. When he finally lowered the rifle, his hands were trembling. Not from fear, he was too old for that, but from the certainty that this wasn't over. That night, rain began to fall. The valley darkened under a curtain of storm clouds. Elias lit a lantern and moved the horses back inside. Spirit circled protectively around Hope, her muscles tense. He checked the doors, then sat by the stall with the rifle across his lap. The rain drummed hard against the roof, masking every other sound. He kept his eyes on the shadows, waiting for movement. At one point, he thought he saw a flicker of light far down the valley, a lantern swinging through the trees. He couldn't be sure. Maybe it was just lightning. Maybe not. The hours dragged on. The fire in the lantern began to fade, the flame shrinking to a dull glow. Elias rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. He told himself Red wouldn't come back tonight. Not in this weather. But deep down, he knew better. Outside, thunder rolled again, louder this time, closer. Spirit whinnied sharply, ears pricked toward the door. Elias stood, the rifle steady in his hands. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "If he's out there, he won't get past me." Lightning flashed, bright enough to light the valley for an instant. And in that instant, Elias saw movement by the fence. 3 shadows, 3 horses, they were back. The next flash showed Red Dawson climbing off his horse, a rope coiled in one hand. Elias took a slow breath and stepped toward the door. "So that's how it's gonna be," he muttered. "All right then." Outside, the storm unleashed itself in full force, wind screaming through the valley like an angry spirit. Inside the barn, man and beast waited together, hearts steady, ready for what was coming. The storm of men and nature had arrived, and before dawn, someone would fall. Rain poured in sheets, drumming against the barn roof, beating like a war drum. The wind howled through the cracks in the wood, carrying the scent of mud, pine, and danger. Elias Carter stood in the half-light of the lantern, rifle in hand, every muscle drawn tight. Outside, lightning flashed again, sharp, white, merciless, and for an instant, he saw them. 3 men moving through the storm, shadows against the fence. Red Dawson was leading the way, a coil of rope over one shoulder, his coat soaked and plastered to his back. The scar on his cheek gleamed when lightning struck again. Behind him, his 2 companions fanned out, their movements slow and deliberate. Elias's heart pounded, steady as the ticking of a clock. He turned to Spirit, who was pacing inside her stall, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. "Stay with me, girl," he whispered. Hope whimpered softly beside her, trembling at the thunder. Elias crouched and touched the foal's neck. "You're safe. I promise." The promise sounded thin against the roar of the wind. Then came a voice, muffled but cruelly familiar. "Carter, you got one last chance. Step aside and let me take what's mine." Elias moved to the barn door, rain blowing in through the cracks. "She's not yours, Dawson," he called. "Turn back while you still can." Red's laugh sliced through the storm. "You think you can play hero? You're just an old man with a dying rifle. Maybe, Elias said, but I still know how to aim. A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind whistling through the valley. Then Red raised his hand. "Take the mare!" he shouted. The first man lunged forward, throwing a lasso toward the barn entrance. It missed, catching on the post. Spirit screamed, rearing high, hooves striking sparks on the floorboards. Elias fired once into the air, the sound cracking like lightning itself. The man ducked and stumbled back, shouting over the rain. "Next one goes through you," Elias warned. Red snarled. "You always were stubborn." He pulled his revolver free and fired toward the barn. The bullet struck the doorframe inches from Elias's head, splintering wood. Spirit reared again, this time breaking through the half-open gate. "Spirit, no!" Elias yelled, but she was already outside, a streak of fury and fire against the storm. The mare charged into the open, her mane whipping like flames in the rain. Red's horse shied back as Spirit barreled toward them. One of Red's men tried to grab her bridle, but she lashed out, her hooves catching his shoulder and sending him sprawling into the mud. Red shouted curses, trying to steady his mount. "Rope her!" Now, Spirit turned sharply, nostrils flaring, eyes glowing with pure, wild rage. She wasn't just running, she was defending. Behind her, the barn door swung wide, and Hope cried out, the high, frightened sound of a child calling for its mother. Elias ran into the rain, rifle gripped tight. "Get away from her!" he shouted. Red turned, gun in hand. "You should have stayed inside, old man." The next moments blurred together. Rain, thunder, fire. Red fired once. Elias dove aside, the bullet grazing his arm. Pain seared through him, but he didn't stop. He fired back, the shot hitting the ground near Red's boots. Horses screamed, rearing in panic. Spirit lunged forward, teeth bared, and slammed into Red's horse. Both animals stumbled. Red hit the ground hard, rolling through the mud. His gun flew from his hand and vanished into the darkness. "Get him off me!" Red shouted to his men, but the others were already breaking, one clutching his shoulder, the other scrambling to grab his panicked horse. The chaos swallowed them whole. Elias staggered toward Spirit, clutching his bleeding arm. "Easy, girl," he gasped. "Easy!" But Spirit wasn't finished. She reared high above Red, her silhouette flashing white under the storm's fury. For one terrifying moment, Elias thought she'd crush him. Red threw up his arms to protect his face, crawling backward through the mud. "Spirit!" Elias shouted, voice raw. The mare froze mid-motion, hooves striking air. For a heartbeat, everything hung in silence. The rain, the thunder, even the wind seemed to stop. Then she came down, slamming her hooves into the ground beside Red's head, inches from his skull. He screamed, scrambling away like a whipped dog. His horse bolted into the dark, and his men followed, vanishing down the trail. Within seconds, the valley was empty again, except for the pounding of rain and the echo of retreating hooves. Elias stood in the middle of it all, chest heaving, rain mixing with the blood on his sleeve. Spirit turned to him slowly, her flanks slick and trembling, her breath coming hard. For a moment she looked every bit the wild creature she was, untamed, magnificent, dangerous. Elias lowered the rifle. "It's over," he said softly. Spirit took a step toward him, then another. The rage in her eyes melted into something else. Trust, maybe even gratitude. She lowered her head, pressing her muzzle gently against his shoulder. Elias closed his eyes, resting his good hand against her neck. "You did it, girl," he whispered. "You saved us." They stood like that for a long time, surrounded by the rain, the world holding its breath. When the storm finally broke and the clouds began to drift away, Elias looked toward the ridge. The first faint light of dawn was creeping over the peaks, painting the wet valley in shades of silver and blue. He led Spirit back to the barn, where Hope was waiting, crying softly. The foal pressed against her mother's side the moment she entered, and Spirit nuzzled her, all fury gone, replaced by tenderness. Elias sank onto a bale of hay, exhaustion washing over him. He pressed a hand to his arm. The bleeding had slowed, but it still burned like fire. After a while, the sound of hooves approached again, this time gentle, cautious. Clara burst through the barn door, raincoat dripping, eyes wide with fear. "Elias!" I saw gunfire from the valley. What happened? He managed a faint smile. "They won't be back." Her gaze dropped to his arm. "You're hurt." "It's just a scratch," he said. "I've had worse." She shook her head, exasperated, and tore a strip from her scarf to wrap the wound. "You're impossible, you know that?" Elias chuckled, though the sound came out weak. "So I've been told." She looked at Spirit and Hope, then back at him. "They fought for you." He nodded slowly. "We fought for each other." Outside, the last drops of rain fell from the roof, pattering softly against the mud. The storm had passed, leaving the air clear and still. The valley smelled of wet earth and pine, and for the first time in years, Elias felt something that had long been missing: peace. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as Clara's hands tightened the bandage. Spirit stood nearby, her gaze calm, her foal safe beside her. The danger was gone, but Elias knew it wasn't truly over. He'd faced the men who came to take what they didn't understand, but something deeper had been stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt since Mare died. Redemption, maybe, or grace. As the sun broke through the clouds, a golden light filled the barn, warm and clean. Spirit lifted her head, eyes catching the dawn. Elias looked up too, whispering under his breath, "You're free now." The mare turned slightly, as if listening. Beyond the valley, the mountains glowed like fire in the morning light, and the air shimmered with promise. The storm had cleansed the land, and in its wake, something new was beginning. Elias didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to find out. And somewhere deep in the wild, thunder still rolled, not a threat now, but a memory, fading slowly into peace. The first touch of spring came to Bitterroot Valley like a soft sigh. The snow melted from the ridges, dripping down through the pine roots to feed the swollen streams. The land that had once seemed endless and cold now shimmered with green, and the air carried the scent of new grass and wood smoke. Elias Carter stood outside his cabin one morning, the sun warm on his weathered face, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace that didn't hurt. The storm had ended weeks ago, but its memory still lived in him. The thunder, the gunfire, Spirit's wild cry cutting through the night. Red Dawson and his men hadn't returned. Word in town was that they'd limped out of the valley battered and humiliated, bound for the Wyoming border. Nobody in Silver Creek had much sympathy for them. Elias's wound had healed, leaving a thin scar down his arm. Clara had been there through the worst of it, coming every day to change the bandages, bringing stew and company, pretending she wasn't worried, though he could see it in her eyes. She still came now, even after the bandages were gone. Some mornings she'd bring biscuits, other times just herself and a kind of quiet that matched his. That morning, she found him fixing the corral fence. Spirit and Hope were grazing nearby, their coats gleaming under the bright light. Hope was walking almost normally now, the limp barely visible. Every few minutes, she'd buck and kick at the air, full of the life that once seemed impossible. Clara stopped her horse at the gate, watching them for a while before speaking. "She's healing fast," she said. Elias turned, smiling. "Faster than I did." She dismounted and came closer. "That's because you're stubborn," he chuckled. "Takes one to know one." They worked together for a time in easy silence, hammering nails, mending rails. Clara passed him tools without needing to ask what came next. They'd fallen into a rhythm that felt old and familiar, as if they'd done this 100 times before. When they were finished, she wiped her hands and looked toward the horses. "They'll leave soon," she said quietly. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Will you try to stop them?" He looked at her, then shook his head. "You can't keep what was born free. You can only love it long enough to help it heal." For a long while, neither spoke. Spirit lifted her head, watching them from across the field, ears twitching at the sound of their voices. Hope was lying beside her in the grass, the two of them framed by the pale blue of the mountains. Clara took a deep breath. "You know, you've changed since that night." Elias laughed softly. "Got a few more scars, if that's what you mean." "No," she said. "I mean you stopped hiding. When I first came up this mountain, you were just a shadow. I don't see that man anymore." He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, but steady. "I thought being alone would keep me safe," he said. "But the truth is, I was just waiting to die slow." Then she came in that storm, wild, bleeding, desperate, and she looked at me like I was worth trusting. I guess I needed that Clara stepped closer. Maybe grace finds us in strange ways. He met her eyes and saw something there, something gentle, something that made him feel young and uncertain again. He almost said what was in his heart, but before he could, Spirit neighed loudly from the field. Hope had stood up and was running, truly running for the first time. Her legs were steady now, her body strong. She galloped in a wide circle, the sunlight glinting off her coat, and Spirit ran beside her, their movements perfectly matched. Clara smiled, tears in her eyes. "Look at them." Elias leaned on the fence, voice low. "Freedom looks good on them." They watched until the horses slowed, until the world seemed to hold still again. Then Clara spoke softly. "When they go, you'll be alone again." "What then?" Elias didn't answer right away. He was still watching the horizon, where the meadow met the dark line of the forest. "I won't be alone," he said at last. "Not really. This land's got a way of keeping you company if you listen right." Clara studied him, then smiled faintly. "Still, I might come by from time to time, just to make sure you're listening properly." He turned toward her, smiling fully this time. "You're welcome any time, Clara Monroe." That evening, the valley burned gold with the setting sun. Elias sat on the porch, the rifle cleaned and oiled, the smell of supper drifting from the cabin. Clara had gone home hours ago, promising to return after the next rain. The world felt quiet, at peace. Spirit and Hope stood near the creek, drinking. The foal had grown taller, stronger, her coat sleek and bright. Elias could tell it was almost time. He'd seen it in the way Spirit looked toward the ridge every morning, her ears twitching to the call of something far beyond the valley. He rose slowly, walked down to the corral, and leaned on the fence. "You're feeling it too, huh?" he said softly. the pull of the wild. Spirit lifted her head, meeting his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only calm understanding. Hope came to stand beside her, nuzzling her shoulder. Elias opened the gate. The hinges creaked, the sound breaking the evening stillness. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You already gave me more than I deserved." Spirit hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. The setting sun caught her coat, turning it to fire. She touched her muzzle to his chest just once, a gentle goodbye. Then she turned, and with a low whinny, she galloped toward the ridge. Hope followed, her hooves drumming against the earth, strong and sure. Elias watched them climb higher and higher until their shapes became small against the horizon. At the top, Spirit paused, her mane lifting in the wind. She looked back once, then they were gone, swallowed by the wild. The valley felt impossibly still. The only sound was the river and the wind moving through the pines. Elias stood for a long time, hat in hand, staring at the place where they'd vanished. His throat ached, but not from sadness. It was something else, something close to gratitude. He turned back toward the cabin, the light fading around him. The old loneliness that used to feel like a wound now felt like something gentler, quieter, like an old song that had finally reached its end. Inside, he stirred the fire and sat down at the table. The cabin didn't seem so empty anymore. He reached for his journal, the one he hadn't opened since Mare died, and began to write. Not about pain this time, but about life. The storm, the mare, the foal, the way grace had come to him on 4 hooves through wind and rain. When he was done, he set the journal aside and leaned back in his chair. Outside, night had fallen. The stars came out one by one, bright and cold and endless. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." He didn't know if he was speaking to the horses, to the mountains, or to Mare herself. Maybe all 3. It didn't matter. The words felt right. Elias rose, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The wind was cool, the air clear. Far off, from somewhere deep in the wild, came the faintest echo. A horse's whinny, soft and fleeting. He smiled. "Run free, Spirit. Run free." Then he turned back inside, the light from the fire spilling across the floor, warm and steady against the mountain night. And for the first time in years, the man who had once been lost in his own silence felt whole again. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.